Now we're going to be looking at how I use PZAC as a technique to structure my paragraphs about Mr. Birling and everything he represents in the play. So again, just to quickly recap, PZAC is a point about a character or a theme that you would have as your sentence starter in your paragraph, right? Then you bring in the evidence, then you analyze and explain the evidence, obviously looking at the linguistic and structural techniques that are used, how it is used to depict Mr. Birling as, you know, the capitalist, as the powerful man, as the part of the wealthy classes. Then you zoom into words and then into techniques within the quotation that you're analyzing to further explain what you mean. And then you, of course, like I said to you, bring in context. Without context, your paragraph is incomplete. Of course, you won't get any marks for context if you don't write about context. So let's get straight into it. So here is a quotation. And the question is, explain how or explore how Priestley presents Mr. Birling in an inspector call. And it's quite a broad question. That means there are lots of opportunities for you to speak about Mr. Birling and the different ways in which he is portrayed and the different ways in which he actually demonstrates the ideas of that time, historically, socially, and politically, as well as the themes that he brings forth through his character, his conduct, his words, and his actions. So the quote that I've chosen this time is, let's read it. Now you have brought us together, and perhaps we may look forward to a time when Crofts and Birlings are no longer competing, but working together for lower costs and higher prices. Now in this quotation, there are quite a few themes that come through. Now let's have a look at how that comes through. And this is my sentence starter, and this is where I'm making a point about Mr. Birling, or I could have made a point about the theme that he represents. But what I've chosen to do is make a point about Mr. Birling and also link the theme that you represent straight away in my sentence starter. So I'm saying, through Mr. Birling, Priestley demonstrates ideas about power and social position in an inspector calls. He does this through the importance that the Birlings attribute to their financial position and class in society. Now, straight away, the examiner knows I know my thematic links with my characters. I know what the character represents in the play. I know what Priestley tried to actually illustrate through Mr. Birling in the play. And this is where I start getting marks for AO1, Assessment Objective 1, in my essay. Now let's move on. Now it's still AO1, and I'm expanding further, and I'm saying this is clearly evident when Mr. Birling says that they need to keep labor costs down and prices up, which suggests that his social position as a wealthy middle-class businessman allows him to subject the working classes and people like Eva Smith to exploitation and unfair treatment in the workplace. Birling is presented as arrogant, selfish, only caring about his social status and his financial status, as indicated in "It's my duty to keep labor costs down," which further disempowers people like Eva Smith. Now, here, guys, I've written a lot that will give me marks for AO1. Okay, I've spoken about Mr. Birling's character and how he's depicted in the play. I'm speaking about the themes that he's linked to, about power, exploitation, inequality and unfair treatment in the workplace. I'm talking about social class, where he strengthens, his position as the upper class or middle class man as compared to the working classes. But now let's go further into how I look at and demonstrate getting marks for AO2. Right, so now I'm saying, and I'm really talking about in interrogating the words that are actually used by Mr. Birling. Right, furthermore, I'm saying that the juxtaposition, now juxtaposition is a contrast, as you know, indicated in costs up and prices down symbolizes the difference and contrast between the affluent people of society and the poorer working classes in Brumley. This contrast in society strengthens the social position of the upper and middle classes by protecting their identity and concealing their wrongdoings. Moreover, I'm zooming in now, the nouns, costs, and prices also highlights his priorities and false notions of being successful with no real consideration for the people, the real people who contribute to their success. And I'm talking about the success of the wealthy upper classes in society. Now I go on to AO3 to try and demonstrate my knowledge of context. In this way, Priestley reflects a period where social mobility was very limited, that this led to ingrained attitudes that reinforced social position and power during the Edwardian era in 1912. The capitalists, like the Birlings, promoted attitudes of superiority and inequality by exploiting the working classes as depicted through Eva Smith. This paragraph very clearly outlines AO1, AO2, and AO3, and that's what you need to also demonstrate in your answer. Now, the quotation I've decided to speak about and explore in my next paragraph about Mr. Birling, because remember, I'm always linking to my question, and my question is about how does Priestley portray Mr. Birling. So here the quote is, as a hard-headed businessman who has to take risks and know what it's about, I say you can ignore all the silly pessimistic talk, and that's Mr. Birling speaking again. And we can see there's loads of, ideas we get about how he thinks and what he feels through this quote, and we can link it to the themes as well. So what do I say for AO1? So I'm starting off with my sentence starter again, and I'm saying Priestley presents ideas about capitalism and ignorance through Mr. Birling. His false sense of optimism and callous and dismissive nature as an exploitative businessman is presented when he says, you can ignore all this pessimistic talk. Now you can see I'm getting there my marks for AO1 because I brought in my evidence, which means I get marks for assessment objective 1. I also brought in ideas about the themes, capitalism, and the ignorance, the character of Mr. Birling, which gives me marks for AO1 as well. Let's go on to AO2. How do I get marks for linguistic devices and the analysis of the evidence? Priestley uses the alliteration, or Priestley makes use of the alliteration in hard-headed businessman, which depicts Mr. Birling as a ruthless, profit-driven man who lacks any compassion for the working classes. Furthermore, the use of the pronouns I and you suggests that he thinks highly of himself as an authority on everything. The use of dramatic irony here portrays his lack of foresight and his inability to be realistic. Okay, I'm sure you agree with that. We can see he's quite dismissive in nature, right? He uses these pronouns. I've zoomed into the pronouns I and you, suggesting some self-importance. For AO3, I'm now talking about context, and let's see how I bring that in. Through Mr. Birling, Priestley introduces ideas about exploitation and the rise of industrialization. It was a time when industrialists like Mr. Birling kept labor costs low and prices high to maximize their profits with no regard for worker rights and well-being. The flamboyance and extravagance of the wealthy classes reinforced the contrast in society that existed. Now, here, as you can see, for AO1, AO2, and AO3, I'm talking about, I'm linking in and embedding my quotations. I am zooming into linguistic devices like the alliteration, the pronouns, and I've brought in my thematic links as well. So that example would be another example of another paragraph in my essay. Let's move on. Okay, now I'm talking now about the quotation where Mrs. Birling speaks, and she says, "Now just be quiet so that your father can decide what we ought to do." Straight away we see ideas of that era coming in as well. My AO1 point would look something like this. Through Mr. and Mrs. Birling's attitudes to their children, Priestley conveys the fact that Mr. Birling is the undisputed head of the household. The children could not have their own views and opinions and had no decision-making powers. They were subjected to family pressure and therefore had to conform regardless of their own viewpoints. Now we see that coming through with the generation gap, don't we? Right? Now my AO2 point will look something like this, and you could have something different, of course. The imperative phrase, "be quiet," clearly conveys Priestley's concern with the condescending attitude of the older generation, who gave instructions about appropriate conduct and behavior in order to be socially acceptable. Furthermore, the father, as the undisputed head of the household, is clearly conveyed through Mrs. Birling's subservience to the title of father. We see that the noun and the title of father was revered as the figure of authority in the family, as he had the power to decide what we, or they in this case, ought to do. Now that is very clear as well, right? The fact that it was a patriarchal society, it was a male-dominated society, the fact that even though Mrs. Birling was part of the upper class, she was still subservient and submissive to her husband, who was Mr. Birling and the head of the family and the household. My AO3 point looks something like this. Through this imperative phrase, Priestley also reveals ideas about the Edwardian era, which were characterized by patriarchal views of male superiority and female submissiveness and subservience. For a post-World War II audience, this would have raised questions, as many families were left without fathers due to lives being lost at war, as you know. Women were starting to develop a more prominent role in society that earned them respect, because remember, they were the sole breadwinners, especially after the war. Okay guys, now I hope that has helped you to understand how you would write an answer that includes the skills that you need to demonstrate in your exam. That is all your assessment, those are all your assessment objectives, AO1, AO2, AO3, and of course points that hit all the AOs will give you a top mark essay. I hope that you have learned something from this video. Thanks for watching guys, and don't forget to share if you think it's useful to other students as well. Thank you. I do hope that you found this lesson useful today guys. Please like, subscribe and share, and if there's any specific topic you would like help on, do leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.